Hello everyone and welcome to Chemsafety's latest Hazardous Substances webinar. I'm Janet Connochie and you've probably seen me in many of these before. Coming up to 24 years at Chemsafety, and so I've certainly seen a thing or two as I've been around the country. If you have any questions as we go through, please put those into the Q&A and I'll review those at the end. But I'll take a wee pause at each section break and have a look and see if anything's come up in the chat as well. Thank you to those of you who submitted questions in advance. They'll either be covered as we go through the presentation today, or there's one in particular that we'll cover in detail at the end. Our details will be in the follow-up email, so if you do have any questions later, let us know, and the presentation link will be sent by our sales manager, Chrissy, and she'll also include the link to the recording of today's session. Today, I'm going to go through some of the things that have been happening with hazardous substances since our last webinar last year. And so these are going to include the EPA requirements for importers and manufacturers, the WorkSafe regulatory clarifications, touch on some PCBU responsibilities, have a look at cosmetic product compliance, fuel storage, AI, and some regulation changes. So that should be quite a broad session for us this morning. So first up are the requirements from the EPA for manufacturers and importers. So the EPA covers the rules around the approvals and labelling and safety data checks and all the things that manufacturers and importers need to do. And as part of that, there are reporting requirements for manufacturers and importers of hazardous substances. So at the beginning of this year, EPA opened their reporting and notifications portal, as we can see here. It had been a requirement for many years that importers and manufacturers notify EPA that they exist and that they are an importer or manufacturer. From January this year, the business information that needs to be notified to EPA, as well as your contact details and your address there, is your New Zealand business number and the approval numbers of all of the substances that you import or manufacture. If you're only importing one or two things, that's quite straightforward. And also it's the approval numbers, not the product name. So if you are importing a range of 250 different cleaning products, that might only be covered by half a dozen group standards. So it's those group standard number approvals that you need to be notifying through the portal. In addition to that business information notification, that only needs to be updated when there's a change in your details or you're adding different substance approvals. For specified active ingredients, and I'll look at those very shortly, there is annual reporting requirements. And so this is reporting the quantity of active ingredients that you are importing or manufacturing for these substances. The reports for 2025 are due at the end of May. So that's in a couple of days' time. So if you are an importer or manufacturer of these products, then hopefully you've got all your figures in and your reporting completed. These are the substances that require annual reporting. So it's agrochemicals, including pesticides, but not including fertilizers, methyl bromide or EDN, and some selected veterinary medicines, so not all of them. Timber treatment chemicals, anti-sap stain chemicals, and anti-fouling paints are also in these reporting categories. So these are substances that are used in the environment that the EPA is wanting the annual reporting for. That's the nuts and bolts of those reporting requirements. Next up, we'll have a look at the regulatory clarifications. So over the years, and it's more than 20 years that we've been dealing with the hazardous substances and the HAZNO regulations, there's been a number of clarifications that have been published through the test certifier or the compliance certifier updates in the past, which is a semi-formal way of doing these. In the last year or so, WorkSafe have been putting this type of clarification, which is aimed at making sure that there's consistency across interpretations of the regulation, into a very formal publication which has technical and legal review, and these are in the form of regulatory clarifications. So we'll have a look at some of these now. You'll find these on the WorkSafe website if you search for regulatory clarifications. So going forward, this is where we would expect to find more of this information. There have also been technical positions and policy clarifications as well that cover different topics. So there are 5 that we're going to look at now that have been published by WorkSafe from February last year. So this one is about where does one hazardous substance location end and when does another one start? And this is important when it comes to duration of certificates or what your separation distances are. So there are a couple of examples in this clarification, and it gives the example of a campground. So you might be a campground and you've got a number of LPG installations. How do you group those together into separate quantities? So the threshold for certification for LPG is 100 kilograms. And so you might have cabins, and each of those cabins has got 2 cylinders on it. So each installation less than 100 kilograms. When would they be counted, need certification or not? And then there might be a laundry facility on site that has a larger quantity. So this publication gives us the general principle that if an incident at one location would impact on another, then they should be counted together as one hazardous substance location. The WorkSafe clarification refers out to the guidance that was published by Gas New Zealand, or the LPG Association as it was at the time, around specific distances when it comes to LPG. The clarification doesn't give examples for other classes, but for flammable liquids, the rule of thumb that we look at is if you've got a store with a separation distance around it, as long as if that separation distance doesn't impinge on another flammable liquid store, then you would count them as separate locations. But if the separation distance overlapped with another store, then you would expect, or the purpose of the separation distance is to make sure that an incident at one's not going to spread. So if your separation distance overlaps with another flammable liquid store, we then group those quantities together and add a larger distance for that combined quantity. This clarification from August last year relates to transportable containers of class 6 and 8. And it's a technical reading of the regulations. So there are separation distances specified in Part 13 for packages of toxic and corrosive substances, and there are separation distances in Part 17 for stationary containers containing toxic and corrosive substances. A transportable container, such as an IBC, and you get a lot of IBCs of corrosive substances around the country, is neither a package nor a stationary container, and so there's a bit of a gap in the regulations if you're reading them literally, and that's exactly what lawyers do when we start looking at the regulations from a very technical perspective. There's a gap when it comes to transportable containers for IBCs. So this clarification from WorkSafe points out the principle that just because the regulations have a gap there doesn't mean that there's no obligation. So we can look at the Act itself and its overarching responsibility to manage our the risks associated with work. And there's also a general risk management regulation and the hazardous substance regulations as well. So we need to look at what the appropriate risk management for this, for something that could go wrong with our toxic or corrosive substances, if there's not a specific regulation to apply. And so WorkSafe's position in this clarification is that we apply the separation distances from the applicable standards. And those are the same as the separation distances that are referred to in Part 17 for tanks. And if you compare the standard with the distances in Part 13 for packages, they align up very well. That those distances are all based on the standard there. So it's a gap in the regulations, but it doesn't mean that you don't need to manage your risks. Earlier this year, there was a position put around for chlorine drums. So chlorine gas used in water treatment often comes in 900 kilo or 1 ton drums, and they're heavy and they need to rest on a nice support so that they are not damaged. When we're looking at incompatible substances around class 5 gases, then anything that is combustible is deemed incompatible, and if we're at a hazardous substance location, then that needs to be a distance away from your substance. It's long held industry practice that some of these cradles used to support the chlorine drums are made of wood, and wood is a combustible substance. The regulatory clarification that WorkSafe have put out goes into some detail about what the investigations that have gone on, and there was a study that was done in the United States, the Jackrabbit project, that looked at what the actual risk would be if chlorine gas or liquid chlorine from the cylinder were to escape, and would that likely react with the hardwood there. And it's determined that the risk is such that hardwood can be used for the feet of those chlorine drum cradles. This clarification is looking at stationary container systems and how long the compliance certificate should be issued for. So there are a number of areas when we're looking at the duration of a certificate for a stationary container system that we would look at to determine what that period is. And this clarification outlines what those are. So whether it's from the regulations themselves, or there are a couple of safe work instruments that relate to stationary container systems, and then there's the default period as well if you don't have information for a longer period than the default is 1 year. So this is a good clarification for people with stationary container systems about how long their certificate should be issued for. And another clarification that has come about from a gap that existed in the regulations. And the change from the HASNO to the HASWA regulations in 2017, it was a bit of a typo. And the referencing in the requirements for when you need to have records for your stationary container systems, it was a bit of a circular reference. And if you read it literally, it said you need to have records to show that you're keeping records. And the intent for that, and it has since been corrected in the regulations, is that the relevant PCBU needs to have records that show how their stationary container system complies with Part 17. But until that got corrected, there was a bit of a gap. So there is a period where people may not have all the records that they should have around the compliance of their tank. Looking at the records that PCBUs have for their tanks, there is a lot of gaps. There are a lot of gaps in what we would like to see, particularly for older systems, but even making sure that if you're getting a new stationary container system installed, that you get the records of the design and the installation that show it's compliant. The regulation talks about a relevant PCBU, because certainly with a number of tanks, it might be a different party that owns the tank than does the operation of it. And so making sure that both PCBUs either have copies of or know exactly where those records are is important. And you certainly don't want to get into a position where you've got two relevant parties and each is thinking that the other has the records. We find when we do the stationary container certification that we are trying to collate as many records as possible, and sometimes just having to do the best as we can with the limited records available. So those are the 5 clarifications that have been published to date at a Hui for certifiers earlier this week. WorkSafe advised another 3 that are relatively close to publication. and there's some more that are further down the road in getting their consultation and their approvals done. So the ones that they advised should be coming up soon. Don't ask me how long soon is. Relates to the storage of Class 3.1C flammable liquids in containers greater than 60 litres. And I haven't seen a draft or anything of this, but my guess around what this covers is another one of those, is an IBC, a package or a container questions, and that if it's 3.1C in packages that are greater than 60 litres, there's a smaller separation distance than if it was a 3.1C in an IBC, which is of course greater than 60 litres. There is some clarification coming around the ethanol water dilutions intended for drinking. And I'm just going to have some water now. Entirely no ethanol in that. So this is in particular important for distillers. There are alternative provisions for potable ethanol, alcohol that we're going to drink, in the regulations. And one of the things that this clarification is expected to do is to clarify when that dilution is actually covered by the intended for drinking provision, which is really important because the provisions of the facility meets the requirements for the dilutions section as an alternative means. It means you don't need certification, and there's a number of other things that make it more straightforward, but you do have additional controls to put into place. So whether or not your stock solution of ethanol that you may be bringing in to infuse or further distill, mix or blend, will be an important clarification to see. And I do know that WorkSafe has had a lot of consultation with the distilling industry about this. And the last one that should be coming up shortly is around walls around liquid oxygen tanks. So if you've got oxygen either in gas cylinders or in a liquid oxygen tank, then you need to have a controlled zone around your oxygen. And this is to ensure that unauthorised people are not going to be impacted, or the public, anyone else, is not going to be impacted in the event that there's a leak or a failure of it. And that distance or that separation can be bounded either by a distance or by a fire rated wall. And this clarification is looking at how high that wall needs to be, because you get some very tall oxygen tanks, but all of the likely points of failure for it are at a lower level. So we'll expect to see that clarification come out, telling us more details around the height of those walls. My next discussion point, I just wanted to touch on some of the PCBU responsibilities and look at some of the improvements that could be made in what we're seeing from people. It's really, really nice to be dealing with fully engaged, proactive people at the sites that we go to. And I expect all of you would fall into that category because you're proactive and you're coming to these webinars to learn about it. But we do find, surprisingly, that there are some PCBUs that don't have much engagement at all with what their obligations are in relation to hazardous substances, and that's quite disappointing. So one area where we do find this coming up is when we're helping clients with their safety data sheet preparation. And so we come across times when people don't know the full information about the substances that they're importing. And it's usually importing. If you're manufacturing something, then you should know what all the ingredients are, but some of the components that you are using may fall in the I'm not quite sure what's in it category. It is the responsibility of the importer or manufacturer to ensure that their hazardous substance complies with a relevant approval. And we do see the EPA contacting people about this, either from looking at enforcement around compliance safety data sheets or other means. So EPA do engage in enforcement around this area. making sure you know all the ingredients is really important when it comes to cosmetic products. And I'm going to talk about those shortly as well, because there are a number of schedules to the approval for cosmetic products with restricted and prohibited ingredients for New Zealand, which may not be the same in all jurisdictions. So knowing all of the components is essential for ensuring that the product is compliant and that we can allocate the correct group standard. If we had a look at the ingredients listed here, there is insufficient information to get a good classification. The concentration ranges are too broad, and there is some place for commercial trade secrets when it comes to what you put on your labels and safety data sheets, but we still need to know what those are in order to get the classification correct. And there's ways of working with those in NDAs and other ways of ensuring that the correct classification is determined while maintaining appropriate commercial sensitivity. And we only need to have a look at some of the recent recalls regarding asbestos in children's toys. And there's been a new batch of recalls this week, as well as the standard issues identified last year, to get an idea that there's no central oversight of everything that's being imported or products that people are putting into the market. There's a lot of reliance on people doing the right thing, and it goes wrong. And the other thing I wanted to say about PCBU duties, and I've probably said this many times before, is that under the hazardous substance regulations, nearly everything that we're looking at for compliance, that we're checking off for certification, it's all that the PCBU must do these things. It's the PCBU's duty to ensure that all of these things are in place. It's my role as a compliance certifier to come to your site and verify that the PCBU has done these things, and you can provide me with evidence to that effect. And many of you are fantastic at that. And we come to site and you've got a dossier put together of all the training that you've done in the last year, and that you've updated your signage because it was fading, and you've done your emergency response plan tests, and your inventory is all up to date. And then we've got another group of customers that rely on the compliance certifier and the inspection each year to remind them that they need to do these things, or to point out that they haven't been done. And that's understandable. We're all very, very busy people out there. There's a lot of things to do. But when you are running a business, there are duties that you have that you need to comply with. And you've got to make sure that you're using your third-party supports appropriately. As I said earlier, I expect the people that come along to these webinars are in the proactive side of things. Another update that has come from the EPA this year has been an update to the Cosmetic Products Group Standard. And so our group standard is closely based on the European Cosmetic Directive, and it's a very, it's been more than 10 years since it was updated, so it's been brought up to align with the EU requirements and also with some other key things around them. Cosmetic products, you might be surprised to learn, and is not just makeup. So the definition of a cosmetic product is anything that is intended to come into contact with the external parts of the human body, and also in your mouth as well. And so anything that's used for cleaning, perfuming, altering appearance, or a deodorant, or protecting them, or moisturizing them, all those sorts of things come under the definition of cosmetic product. And the most common substance that we would perhaps see from a compliance certification point of view or from a location compliance certification point of view would be hand sanitizers. And so making sure that those are, they need to comply with the cosmetic product group standard, they're not as a cleaning product, and the limits that are involved in those. Some of the changes that have come into the group standard, and one of the main ones, I think, is that this group standard now covers non-hazardous cosmetic products if they contain hazardous ingredients. So the end product itself might not be hazardous, but some of the ingredients in it are hazardous when they go in, but they go in at such low concentrations that they're not there. So this enables these non-hazardous products to still be regulated with those restricted and prohibited ingredients that I mentioned earlier. The way that the legislation is written is that the EPA can only do rules and regulations around hazardous substances. So if you've got a cosmetic product with entirely non-hazardous ingredients, then it wouldn't fall under the jurisdiction of the group standard. There is a phase out of the PFASs, often known as forever chemicals. You might be aware of these from a larger scale in their ban in firefighting foams, but surprisingly they're used in cosmetic products. They might be used out for bulking or detangling or skin conditioning or as a solvent or other means there. So the PFAS are a group of thousands of different chemicals, and these are being phased out from cosmetic products. And one of the other changes that's been added is that the UK has been named as a jurisdiction for the labelling requirements. So under the group standard, there are named jurisdictions, so that if your labelling of your product meets one of those jurisdictions, then you don't need to change it. It's acceptable. And when Brexit happened, UK was no longer in the EU, so UK has been added back in as a jurisdiction around that. If you are manufacturing or importing cosmetic products, then you'll need to be aware of the timings around these changes. So you need to make sure that your products comply with the new rules by the beginning of this year, and you can't supply with any cosmetic products that don't comply with the new rules after the end of this year. And then there's different dates for the PFAS, and there are also a couple of other components that have been regulated there, including one of the UV filters there. So there's a bit of a time frame or a transition period for those. All right. We'll change tack now and talk briefly about fuel storage for some reason or other. So both EPA and WorkSafe published some information at the end of March, reminding everyone around the hazardous substances or the rules and hazards of storing fuel, in particular petrol. You're probably all aware that there are the workplace requirements, and the threshold for location compliance certification for petrol at the workplace is 50 litres. So it's a relatively low threshold. You may not be aware that there's also rules for home or other non-workplaces. And those EPA rules for non-workplaces apply to all hazardous substances. So there are restrictions on hazardous substances that you might, or that you are allowed to have at home or other non-workplaces. That same limit of 50 litres before certification is needed applies at home as well. But you usually see it reported that you're not allowed to store more than 50 litres. Any savings that you might be gaining from storing more fuel would be negated by the certification process anyway. But if you did have more than 50 litres of petrol at home, that's not in the fuel tank of your vehicle, then you have needed for years and years and years to have a certification as well. Under the EPA notice, it's called a HAZMO certificate, but it's very similar to what you would do for a location compliance certificate. In all cases, petrol that's in containers 25 litres or smaller must be in a container that's to an approved standard. So there's an American or the ASNZS standard for fuel containers. So, it's been a long time since I did training for service stations, and it still comes to mind one of the horror stories of someone trying to put petrol into a bag. Not the way of dealing with that. So approved fuel containers for any petrol. If you're storing it at work, any petrol containers that are larger than 5 litres, or if you've got more than 15 litres in total, then it must be in a cabinet or another compliant flammable liquid store. That provision doesn't apply at homes, but if it's at a workplace in a container larger than 5 litres or more than 15 litres of it, then it needs to be in a cabinet. So if you've got any 20-litre containers of petrol at work, then they must be in a cabinet or store. As I said, the location compliance threshold for petrol is 50 litres, but that calculation is done with a ratio of your other flammable liquids. So if you had a cabinet that you were operating under the LCC threshold for, you might have some isopropyl alcohol and some paints. If you then added some petrol to that cabinet, it could be quite easy to go over that threshold if you've added that petrol in there when you've taken the calculation into account. So don't just add petrol to an existing store without going through that calculation. And then all your other typical controls around training, safety data sheets, fire extinguisher signages, making sure your ignition sources are kept away are all apply, just as you would expect for any flammable liquid. At home, EPA have put they've got some good guidance on their website for hazardous substances in general there, but some good precautions there. Only store what you need. Make sure you've got the right lid and it's correctly fastened. If it's not, it's going to evaporate. It will create an ignition risk and it's a waste. Allow space for expansion in there, and as I said, only use approved petrol containers. Make sure it's away where children can't get to it, that it's locked and secured, and away from ignition sources and somewhere nice and cool. And strange enough, never smoke near where petrol is stored. Good point there. And let's veer off in another different direction. I am by no means a cutting-edge user of AI tools, but I've seen some cautionary tales that have come to light that I thought I'd perhaps mention to you today. One of the things I'm certainly aware of with AI is things look convincing and believable until it gets to something that you really know about. So you only pick up the errors or the mistakes and things that you know about. And so it's a bit of a cognitive bias that we might pick up mistakes of things that we know about, but assume it's correct for everyone else. And so that's obviously a dangerous path to go down. This was a scenario or a case that came up last year sometime, maybe even the year before. But it was a client who was suggesting that we didn't need to come to visit their site in order to issue a location certificate. And we thought that's a bit odd. The performance standard is very clear that a compliance certifier or someone inspecting on their behalf must visit the location for every time a certificate's issued. And they came back to us with the screenshot from an AI search that they've done. And it says that the compliance certifier may rely on existing information without a site visit. And this really confused me because I thought that's clearly not the case. And I looked into it a bit more, and somewhere where the AI had been getting its information from, it had picked up on a publication from WorkSafe that related to the COVID lockdowns and the steps that were taken and the variations that we used during COVID lockdowns when travel wasn't around. So I think AI was finding an answer to the specific question that was asked, and the client got the answer they were looking for. It just wasn't correct. And I think they took our explanation on board. But it's if you keep searching until you get the answer you want, you might get the answer you want, but it's not the right answer. We've also starting to see documentation come through that has been clearly assisted with AI, and there's nothing inherently wrong with that. And in preparation for this webinar, I gave it a go myself. I asked for a one-page LPG emergency response plan, and it looks good. It's got the information that you want, and I think that's largely helped by the fact that the information that you want to build this is readily available from reputable online sources. And with the tool that I used, it reports to me the sources that the AI used in order to generate the documentation. So making sure that you've got some idea of where the information is being pulled from will help you determine the validity of the information that you're getting. But it takes some time, and it goes through a lot of things, and it can refine it. But we do need to make sure that particularly when you're doing site-specific information or procedures, that you go through very carefully and make sure that it's relevant, or you feed in your relevant things there. So if you've got a flammable liquids procedure for your site, and the document starts talking about safe decanting, but you don't decant on your site, it makes the certifier ask questions around the ignition sources or this hazardous area, and then you talk to the client, and it's not something that they actually do. So making sure that there is a good, robust review of any AI supported material. I'm sure will fall within your own site procedures around that. And you probably do have, well, depending on the scale of your site or your business, you'll have protocols or otherwise of the use of AI. Regulation changes. There's been one. There was a change in the hazardous substance regulations in October last year. And I'm not sure if you've ever had a look at the regulations themselves or how these amendments come about, but this is basically the extent of that amendment regulation. It tells us when it comes into force, and then it goes through and says, make these little changes. And back in the old days, and I've still got copies of documents around where you take the amendment regulation and you get your scissors and your tape and you paste it in. So luckily today, with the regulations online and updated, you get your view of the regulations with all the changes incorporated into it. The purpose of this change to the regulations is around the separation distances required for retail shops for flammable liquids. So there are provisions for retail shops to have a 0 metre separation distance from the protected places of that business. But there were some questions raised around how do those separation distances apply, particularly to the larger hardware stores when they might have a cafe within their building that is a protected place, and it might even be being operated by a different PCBU. It was causing confusion around whether that's covered by the retail shop definition or not. So this this regulatory change, the change in the regulations, clarifies that if you've got a protected place that might be on the same retail site as that shop, but is not necessarily in part of that building, they are all covered by the provisions around that, even if it is a different PCBU. And you may have seen the Minister make an announcement earlier this year around changes that are planned in relation to laboratories. So my understanding at the moment is that the MB are working on changes to the regulations relating to laboratories. So that's Part 18 of the regulations. But we don't yet know any of the specific details as to what is being drafted into that. The Cabinet paper does go into some principles as to what the Minister wants to achieve, but we'll look forward to seeing what those changes are now. And that's sort of overlapped with many years of work that has been going into trying to get a safe work instrument or some published guidance around laboratories. So it's all very much up in the air around that, but look forward to seeing what changes they will be. So that was a very all over the place update of some of the things that have been happening. I did get one question come through prior to the webinar that was looking at laboratories and certified handlers. So I'm going to go into this into some detail now, and then I'll have a look and see if anything has come up in the Q&A. So this question has been posed, and I'm looking at it in the light of the current regulations, but it relates to certified handlers in laboratories and when a certified handler is or is not required. So in the first step, we'll have a look at what actually is a laboratory. And so a laboratory is somewhere where hazardous substances are used in R&D, testing or teaching. And it covers the room or the building or structure where that research or teaching or where the science happens. So a separate store is not considered to be part of the laboratory. And that is a change to the pre-hazardous substance regulations interpretation under the HASNO code of practice. They could be included, but the framework that we're working under at the moment is that a separate store is not part of the laboratory. When is a certified handler required? So a certified handler is required when, and I'm just talking about toxic substances, not explosives, when work using a class 6.1A or B substance is being undertaken. So it needs to be under the substance needs to be under the control of the certified handler, or it needs to be secured so that only the certified handler or other people who are authorised under the control can do so. So if it's not under the personal control of a certified handler, someone who's not a certified handler can handle the substance if the certified handler is present there and is able to provide assistance to it. Unless we're at a laboratory. So under regulation 18.9, at the laboratory, a substance is not required to be under the control of a certified handler. So part of the question that came up is storage of a substance counted as work using the substance? And to address this question, we're looking at the regulation around issuing certificates, and it talks about issuing a certificate to a certified handler for particular phases of the life cycle of that substance, and the performance standard that we need to look at when we are dealing with hazardous certification lists storage as one of those life cycle phases. So storage includes the basic handling of a closed container, but also includes breaking down the substance. So storage is definitely one of the phases of life cycle. It's part of the use or the work with the substance that needs a certified handler. The other phase that comes up around this is when it comes to transport. So if we are transporting packaged substances, talking about packages again, there's a bit of a theme coming through, but if it's being transported in accordance with the Land Transport Dangerous Goods Rule, then a certified handler is not required for it. So if it's being transported, it doesn't need a certified handler, but the transport must comply with the DG rule. So either if it's for hire or award, the person has their dangerous goods endorsement, or if it's tools of trade or other commercial purposes, that the person doing the transporting is complying with the land transport rule. So what we end up with is some fuzzy boundaries. And I'm not going to rule where a line is on those. But my general thoughts and suggestions around this is if you've got a toxic substance, let's say it's a bottle of cyanide that's going to be used in the lab, it's going to be transported to your site, and it would be in that transport phase of life cycle until it's receipted at the store. The certified handler for the store is the person in charge of that. And I would suggest that if the person from the laboratory is coming to the store to collect that, then that's as a person working under the supervision of the certified handler until it gets to the lab, and then it's under the lab provisions where it's going to be, scienced. So that then gives rise to the question about who has access to those substances at the store. And is the store person who's the certified handler there all the time when people are getting substances from there? Or does there need to be additional security so that those substances that require a certified handler, remembering that these are the deadly poisonous ones, are locked away further until that can be authorised by the certified handler or some other protocol in place? So it's not a black and white question, but the storage outside of the laboratory of a 6.1A substance does require a certified handler. Happy to discuss this further offline with anyone as well. So that's all I had prepared in this presentation today. I will remind you that the webinar will join the others on our YouTube channel. If there are any topics that you would like to see, whether a new topic or an update on a previous one, let us know. Or if there's any presentations or training that you'd like for your workplace or an event, do get in touch with us. And at that point, I'm going to pause briefly and we'll have a look and see. I can see some little red marks on the Q&A tab, so let's go and have a look at those. Let's see. Question, do you have to supply business contact information to the EPA, I'm expecting, if you're a small-scale research company with labs operating under exempt laboratory status? If you are that's a good question. I will come back to you separately on that. I don't have an answer off the top of my head. My default one would be yes, but I'm going to think about that some more. Question there. If I've got a location certificate that's been approved, do they need to make any changes relating to LPG? I think that's probably going to be a, you need to make changes. If you're making changes to the location of your store, then that will may need a new certificate, but I'll talk to you separately regarding that as well. Yeah. Do insect repellents come under the cosmetic group standard or the EPA? That is a good question. I have dealt with insect repellents before as to which category they come to, whether they need approval under the ACVM, but I don't know the answer off the top of my head for that. If the annual reporting, so for those agrochemicals, is done by the brand owner, does the contract manufacturing need to do the annual reporting as well? EPA do have some guidance around making sure that there's not duplicated reporting. So it will. There is some specific guidance around that to make sure that there isn't duplicated reporting to them. So I'll have to have a look at those in a bit more detail. What's my view on the Southern California chemical crisis? I haven't. I only heard one brief news report about that yesterday. So I hadn't even heard of. I hadn't heard until this question as to what the substance was there. Looks like it's methyl methacrylate there. I don't know enough about it to have a view on it, but it's very concerning, obviously. And we have got a flammable liquid store that is covered by a compliance certificate. Can we hold smaller quantities outside of the store up to the threshold, or do they need 100% inside the store? There are some small quantities that don't need to be in a particular location, so that it's under, I want to say, regulation 11.4. So yes, you might have a small amount of in-use substances within that threshold that don't have to be in the store. So as I said, for petrol, it's for 3.1A and 3.1B, so it includes petrol. It's containers that are smaller than 5 litres and a quantity less than 15 litres in closed containers. And there's some other provisions around use, and 3.1Cs can have more. Is controlled substance license compulsory when dealing with sodium fluoroacetate at any concentration? I would have to double check the approvals for the particular formulation. So again, we can get back to you on that one. Is there a resource or a reference we can use to determine if a quantity is over the threshold for an LCC? Yes, if you use the Hazardous Substances Toolbox calculator, toolbox on the WorkSafe website, it's the hazardousSubstances.govt.nz toolbox site. If you just put the substances that are going to be at that location into there, it will do that calculation, and it's usually pretty reliable on that, but it does take into account all of the substances that you've entered in there. And then I've created spreadsheets as well that you can just put in quantities if you want to contact me directly. Requirements for importers supplying to laboratories that fall under Exemption 33 of the HASNO Act. How do we register on that portal when exempt? That's similar to a question earlier that I don't have the answer to immediately, so I can go and figure that out. Or the phase out to PFAS be implemented to other industries or cosmetics. Aside from the firefighting foams, of course, I don't know, but I think that is a general direction that people are going in. For the construction sector, as a substance register, do you need to have a register for each individual site, or will the larger regional register be sufficient? There. So one of the things when you're looking at a hazardous substance inventory is we want to be able to identify what's present at the site. So you could have a big single register that identifies each site on there, or you could create a register for each individual construction site. If you're working on a lot of different construction sites and you're using the hazardous substances toolbox calculator as your register, there's a facility in there to copy and duplicate that. So you might have a master like template of one that has all of the substances that are likely to be there, and when a particular project is starting, you could create a copy of it and modify that as needed, or depending on the tools that you're using, generating a subset for it. But the point of, well, one of the points of the register or the inventory is to enable workers, FENS, WorkSafe, your compliance certifier, anyone else to identify what substances are where on a particular site. So you would want to have some site-based places. Noting that WorkSafe talks in HASNO classes still, and the SDSs and GHS, they often don't have the HASNO class. So the safety data sheets don't have to have the HASNO class on them, they have to have the GHS. And you do have to go to other resources for those. So EPA have the classifications notice has a correlation table, and we've got a number of correlation tables on our website as well under resources for hazardous substances, or you can email us directly and we can send you the cross-reference charts that we use for HAZNO to GHS. I'll talk to you specifically, Wendy, about that question. And see, differing interpretations certified and may arise. Go. That's is there. Oh, that's great. Thank you all so much for your attendance. I will end the webinar there. We'll follow up with those questions that I mentioned there, and if anything else comes up, please do let us know. Thank you.